The law of contracting is 1,000 years old. Welcome to the Contract Zone podcast. Hello everyone, this is podcast number 3 on 3 December 2024. Who would have thought? I'm sitting here with my twin brother Hugh. He's an actuary, systems guy. He's been doing it and he's as old as me, God help him.
That's what I used to tell my mother.
Exactly. We're also sitting here with handsome Nick, who's just a pilot. What's he done?
Not much.
yeah.
Just that master's in
atmospheric sciences.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to get there eventually.
We couldn't even say it, but that's okay.
I was working my way up to it.
Totally relevant to this podcast.
Well, it's nice and weathery.
But I got the tech skills, so here I am.
There we go. You're so sadly sitting here with the Contract Zone. We're the Contract Zone. The law of contract is 1,000 years old. And we're taking you through one by one the topics that we care about. And today we're moving into domestic building contracts because we think there's a lot needs to be done by you. We think.
Look, you're building a new house, you're going to sign a contract. What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? Because there's never any complaints.
Never.
No.
And you're dealing with people who are beyond reproach.
That's right. Everyone always has their insurance when it matters.
And they're reliable.
And it's only your fault. It's only your fault. So don't complain to us, please. There's about 1.2 million houses meant to be built in Australia in the next 5 years. Oh, yeah, sure. But there probably will be several 100,000 of them. And every one of those houses is going to cost maybe $500,000 if you're very cheap and maybe $7 million if you're not. But either way, every one of those contracts should be checked by someone who knows what the heck they're doing. Guys will spend $500,000 on a contract, but will not spend a few $100 to have someone just point them to the obviously avoidable things that go wrong in the biggest contract you're ever going to have in your life. Whatever people say, from two old bastards and one handsome younger guy, the first home you buy...
Don't bring our mother into this.
It's all her fault. The most difficult contract you'll ever get into is the first house that you ever buy and ever help. And if you're foolish enough to have it built, then you should be listening to this because this is what we're talking about. The good news. The Domestic Building Contracts Act is a pure consumer protection piece of legislation. Governments for the last 30 years have been trying to protect homeowners from their own building contracts, and they should. This is important stuff. And so we're going to take you through the 3 or 4 key issues. And we know it's eye-glazing, but this is important, and you need to listen to us about this topic. You can ignore the rest, but hear this.
Yeah, I would.
We're going to talk to you about the Domestic Building Contracts Act. We're going to tell you about domestic building insurance, the key. How many people were complaining when that major corporation went down a few months ago and left maybe 10,000 plus contracts unfinished? The building industry has been protected.
Builders don't go broke, do they?
Yeah, no, they don't. Not like you and me, They strangely, they do not. Only every minute. And in every case, in fact, that contract should be covered by domestic building insurance, a pure consumer protection, which works. As a matter of fact, it even worked when those guys went broke and didn't have the right insurances because the government stepped in because it's critical.
And you can rely on them to step in every time, I'm sure.
Well, so far they have, and good on them. But we're saying far better. If you're going to get into a contract, take 2 minutes, get it looked at by someone who knows what the heck they're doing, and let them take you through the key issues.
And also, just to be brutal about it, the government is more likely to step in when there's so many thousand people affected. But if it's just you, good luck.
That's the point. I hate it when he's right, but he happens to be right on that. It was a fluke. Domestic building insurance will take you through the keys and how you check it to make sure you've actually got it. Progress claims. There's a big...
Sorry, just to be clear, you don't have it. Your builder has it.
To be clear, we'll get to it, but no, we won't. We'll do it right now. Domestic building insurance is an insurance that was created in the Building Contracts Act around about 1990, and it covers building owners against losses that they suffer because their builder has gone broke or disappeared or died or simply won't respond. That's the insurance, and we call it insurance, but it's more like a guarantee. It's a government guarantee sitting behind a house builder, courtesy of the Domestic Building Contracts Act. It's a system that works. But you've got to check it. You've got to make sure that you're dealing with a guy who's actually got the insurance. Domestic builders...
And it's got to be current.
Domestic building contract builders, men or women, must have registration as a registered building practitioner in Victoria, and they must be covered by insurance. And the Act itself says they must not accept $1 if not covered by the right insurance. The trouble is, people don't check. They don't check. They don't check they've got the right guy. They don't check that they've got the right registration of the domestic building practitioner. They don't check that they've got the right insurance in place, and yet they start making payments to some builder because they're so in love with the new house and they're so in love, and things go wrong.
Right. So how do they go about checking?
It's an easy system. Firstly, if you're really tragic, go and ask someone who knows how to do it. But if you're a self-help sort of a guy, go to vmia.vic.gov.au. vmi.vic.gov.au. I was about to call it .com.au.
Yeah, why don't I say that?
Yeah, I think you better.
vmia.vic.gov.au.
He didn't correct me. vmia.vic.gov.au.
All right, we got it.
It's sarcasm. We get that from our brides, Nick. It's
no shortage.
Rude. How absolutely rude. The worst part was he was correct. We had said it a few times.
Yeah.
And it matters. And it is worth checking a few times. And if you're not sure, please, I'm begging you, go to someone who knows how to take you to it and make sure that the insurance is in place before your project starts. The Act is there. The insurance is there. But you've got to make sure that, in fact, you're not dealing with some rogue builder who has done none of the above, and happens all the time. Domestic building insurance. There's a whole lot of other protections in there, Yui, for homeowners, and they're all good ones. The first one is payments. There has always been this notion with house contracts that you start and you make stage payments. Don't get a progress claim every month. You make stage payments. There's always been base stage, frame stage, lock-up stage, fixing stage, and then completion. And that now finds its way into the Domestic Building Act. Section 40 of the Act actually expressly says that a domestic building contract must be based on those stages, and then defines those stages. Now, it also gives people, if they want to, the ability, but you've got to do all the right forms, to remove that and go back to progress payment claims every month. I simply say, most of us, that won't work. Most of us get a mortgage from the bank. The bank likes to check each stage and pay each stage, and builders have been doing that forever. So that is the way. In fact, we usually build.
There is a lot of logic to that process, given that you can actually pretty easily establish whether they've achieved those stages.
And it's even easier today than it used to be, because the Act defines what constitutes base stage, defines what constitutes frame, lock-up, fixing stage. As a matter of fact, and this is now we're getting into some esoteric law, it says what's got to be done, but in fact, it's never quite perfect. For example, you might think that lock-up means lock-up, but it doesn't really count about your garage door. There's little exceptions in there. And so it does make sense, and this is where we see the big arguments. It does make sense that people understand what each stage is, what constitutes getting that stage, because you will get progress claims and the builder will expect to be paid within 7 days. And that means that you'll need to be forewarning the bank that it's coming, and they'll need to have their inspector come out and assess it, or whoever's going to assess it. Stage payments is a good system. I hate it when he's right, but it is. And it's critical that homeowners follow the stages and follow the payments going from the builder, from their bank to the builder, all the way through to completion. Program. People often think that programs are something you find in big mega projects. Wrong. There is a program on your domestic building contract too.
Just slow down there, kid. Describe what you mean by program.
A program is simply a graphical display of all the activities that have to be performed by the date. And if you are going to be doing your house, whether it's your first house or your 15th, it makes sense for you to get in charge of your own program, to follow what's going on. It's certainly true that in the contract itself, the only obligation is for the builder to complete the house by a certain date. And that date will be a bit way into the future. And with house contracts, it tends to be a bit really way into the future. And
so it'll indicate, like things like your slabs going down in January, your frame going up in February, that sort of stuff.
Even more, it'll indicate the commencement date is to be the 1st of April 2025, and base stage is meant to be completed by the 1st of July 2025.
If I was building a house and I had a program that said framing in February and stuff like that, I'd be going along every night of my life and getting a photo of where it's up to.
Yeah. Hugh used to have an old joke. He's done a lot of work in the USA with big insurers around there, and we've
lots of contractors
and lots of contracts, and we've always had to laugh about the homeowners being so terrified of
You'd
the
sneak
builder.
down after hours.
They would sneak down when it was dark,
yeah.
and everyone had left, and they would quietly sneak onto their own
Wouldn't
front
want
yard.
that contractor to see you there in your place,
and then peek through the window and hope that they could peek and see something. And ridiculous. It's 2024. It's your land. It's your contract. The contract actually says the owner's entitled to have reasonable access to see what's going on. Truly well experienced homeowners doing building contracts always, in fact, usually have a clerk of work, some old builder who's paid by the hour, who barracks goes down to the site and barracks for only them, but someone who knows what the heck
we actually think that in a perfect world you'd have a bloody webcam on your house.
100%.
Now, you might or might not get that past your contractor because they'll all
I just hate it when he's right, but every now and again he says something sensible.
In general, it's fine for mum and dad building a house. I've done it, and so we can go down to our site and just take photos.
Absolutely,
anytime.
You're certainly entitled to. Now you build them like crack it, which so that's something you have to manage. But
in that case, you got the wrong builder, and the builder himself isn't always right about what the contract does and doesn't say. And I'm telling you for a fact that the contract gives reasonable access to the principal, to the owner, to anyone who's doing a project to go and see their own site and their own project for which they are paying progressively for the construction. It's certainly true that the true contractual position on any construction contract is that the builder has the care and control of the site. The builder is the one who's got to put the safety fences around. And the builder's the one, by the way, who's responsible if something gets stolen off the site, or the site burns to the ground.
Or someone has an accident on the site.
Or someone has an accident on the site. And that's why builders will say to you, and they do say to you, and you've got to say, no, mate, no. The builder will say to you, no, I can't let you on because it's unsafe and I'm responsible under the Act. No, the builder is responsible under the Act, and yet the Act and the contract both give the owner reasonable access to go onto the site and see what the heck's happening. And by the way, how does the builder think you get paid a progress claim if people don't inspect first? The builder knows, and the builder wants you to inspect the progress payment time. It's sensible to say to the builder from the start, mate, I don't want to be difficult, but I will be down pretty much every day.
And if your builder says you can't do that, pick up Johnny's other thing, you probably need another builder.
100%.
In this day and age, people accept, look, you're going to have photos of yourself 48 times each day on Facebook. Why the hell shouldn't you have photos of your own place that you're paying big money to get done?
If you do what we say, and no one does, but if you do what we say, at least you'll be well informed. At least you'll know when the builder hasn't been there for 3 months. At least you'll know when something's been built and then it's still out in the weather because no one's been back to take care of it. And at least you will know when the builder's starting to use the wrong materials or making mistakes. And humans and builders make mistakes. But the real point, this is it, we're begging you, be involved. Keep your own program. Get ready for the progress payments when they're coming. Follow what's going on the site. And I'm completely in favour of the webcam or something like that. It's just, to me, a superb system that keeps people informed. It's a trend all around the world that people who are doing building are going to have real-time, he hates me when I say that, real-time monitoring of the project.
No such thing.
There you go.
Keep going.
But that's the right way to go. No longer, like Austin Powers, do we just leave it all to chance and presume it'll all work out. No, now we have to know what's going on the site and follow it and plan ahead and to make sure the chips never come down.
Yeah, I think this is so important because, while I just bought a house and I was scared of buying a new build because I don't trust new builds in Victoria. And maybe that's just me, but why, maybe you can answer it, why so many new builds in Victoria just built not to standard? I actually have experience in this podcast, I realised, because I lived in a house where my roof blew off because it wasn't strapped down.
You're not kidding, it did blow off.
Not a single strap.
There's a fantastic bit of video footage of the guy putting the roof back on.
Sounds careless to me.
So how does that happen in Victoria where you have, how does it get signed off?
Yeah, and it's not Victoria, it's everywhere in the world, it's everywhere in Australia. New South Wales, more than anything, has had huge developments in the last 10 years to do with apartments more than houses.
Maybe not on the beach at Aspinall, that couldn't go wrong.
On the beach at Aspinall was always going to cause a trouble.
But who's signing it off? Isn't there
it's asking the right question because the truth is a registered building surveyor, also a registered building practitioner. A registered building surveyor is on every job. The building surveyor is usually the most informed person about building standards on the project. The building surveyor has to grant the building permit before it can commence. That's also, by the way, the grant of the building permit is one of the triggers to making sure the insurance is in place. The building surveyor will insist that they have evidence of the building insurance, the town planning permit, if there is a requirement, all the difficult technical issues that most normal human beings would not even imagine exist. The registered building surveyor is the one who does do that.
Who picks the registered building surveyor?
And that is a sexy question.
Sexy.
Sexy.
Very unlikely.
If you're as old as you and I, handsome Nick wouldn't understand this.
He wouldn't understand this.
If we went back a million years ago, every council used to have the building surveyor. And the building surveyor was like Adolf Hitler. And people would go in there and they would beg for a building permit and they would wait for 8,000 years, and the building surveyor was used to it because every rotten, shooty, poor, not understanding builder and homeowner would try to get away with every little thing and then blame the building surveyor that they hadn't caught them doing it. So the building surveyor tended to be very difficult. Around about 1990, all around Australia, it's one of those things where every state does the same act with the same name, but they're all different because they know better. They all created the Building Act. The Building Act 1989 in Victoria, and the same sort of time in all the other states. And one of the many things it did was create the notion of the building surveyor, a private building surveyor being appointed by the builder or the owner. And as a matter of fact, it should always be appointed by the owner. But as a matter of fact,
I bet that never happens.
And it doesn't. And the reason why is because historically builders know how to build, and they know how to get a building surveyor, and they know where they are, and they know how to get them on the job, and they know what they need to give to the building surveyor, whereas owners tend to not.
Am I right in thinking that if you're the owner and the builder has appointed his best mate as the surveyor, which would never happen, right? At the minimum, you should want to meet that surveyor and talk to him on some sort of regular basis?
Not only should you, and I don't buy into the great big conspiracy theory about builders appointing their mates and therefore that. No, building surveyors, it's a really complicated discipline. Guys have a lot of study and a lot of responsibility, and generally, in my humble experience, have always been excellent. Even though the truth is it's easier to get the builder to find the building surveyor, see if someone's available, see who's local in the area, see who understands this sort of construction.
They sound like umpires, Johnny.
It's exactly like umpires. He always teases me because he's
I want the joke.
He's heard my gag.
I want the joke.
I was lucky enough to still do a lot of honorary work for the AFL umpires, and they used to come in, and I only have had one joke. I said, don't worry, because they'd sit there and I said, don't worry, next week when you're umpiring at Marvel, every free kick you give will be booed by 25,000 people.
What's good about that?
And I said, and they'd say, what's good about that? And I say, because the next free kick will be booed by the other 25,000 people. That's who we are in Australia. Well, building surveyors are sort of like that. The building surveyor is a genuinely educated person, and they are carrying huge responsibility.
In theory, even-handed.
And
probably in practice even-handed.
The pressures come from both the owner and the builder all day, every day. And watch what happens when something goes wrong. Everyone blames the building surveyor. Usually the only person who's been on the job and carefully watching. But the building surveyor comes onto the job and grants the first building permit, which itself has to comply with the building regulations, which are detailed and subtle, and they've evolved many times over the years. And then the building surveyor will need to certify that certain things have been achieved, certain stages throughout the project have been achieved. And then the building surveyor will need to ensure that the regulations are being kept. And from time to time, when they're not, building surveyors have to give a stop work notice and all hell breaks loose. So the answer to your question is the building surveyor, who's paid for that role by the owner, even if the builder's paying them, it's in the price. One way or another, the owner's paying for it. But Hugh's right. It makes sense for a truly invested building owner to become involved with the building surveyor, whether they're selected by the owner or the builder, doesn't matter. Usually the builder, because they know what they're doing more than the owner's likely to know. But whoever appoints the building surveyor, it's true that owner should always make time to meet the building surveyor, speak to the building surveyor, follow the process, and then follow the actual building surveyor's work from start to finish. Anyone who's done this process knows historically building surveyors can be a little bit reserved because people are blaming them and attacking them for everything that they don't think is right. And historically, it's the building surveyor is the only one who does know what's correct. But I am saying it makes sense for the owner to not just leave it to the builder.
Yep.
It's a legal requirement, and that's the answer to your question, handsome Nick. At the end of the project, theoretically, it's got a certificate of occupancy or a certificate of final inspection from a registered building surveyor himself, a registered building practitioner in the state of Victoria, and himself covered by professional indemnity insurance. And people regularly blame the building surveyor. So they care, and they're usually, my experience, they're the most invested people on the project, and usually the most qualified, and usually the straightest.
Yep.
For what it's worth.
I got a new question. So you got this project going along, and your building surveyor's sort of doing stuff, and you're even clever enough to talk to him, and you're even clever enough to go and look at your place to see how it's going. And you look at your place and think, that's a great place. You know what? If those windows out the back were double the size, how good would it be for the sun? That's no problem, is it, Johnny?
Yeah, that's called a segue. You're always leading me into the topic of variations. That's usually a little private sign to me that I'm taking too long.
Yeah,
so,
you are.
So on the topic of variations,
Coco would have bitten you if she was still allowed in the room.
If she was still allowed in the room, but there's trouble. We tend to discriminate against mouth breathers. And
she's a very big mouth breather.
They get sent down the stairs for a schmacko, and they never quite get invited back up the stairs. I understand that. I understand the logic, but it's still hurtful. The way we pay for all construction contracts is historically you agree the final price and the final completion date, but you pay progressively that final price throughout the project. On more commercial projects, you pay historically monthly. You get a progress claim every month. You make a progress payment every month. Domestic building contracts, it's the norm that they're paid in stages. And so you'll usually pay a deposit. And the Act itself says you're not to pay more than 10%. In the old days, guys would regularly pay 109% and wonder why it seemed expensive. The Act stops that. And then the Act insists that parties have in their contract the stages unless they go to a lot of paperwork to say, no, we're cleverer than that, we're not going to do that. In fact, most people use the stage payment system. And that means that they will get a claim for progress payments every stage. However, every now and again, things go wrong, things are added, things change. And then
what about my windows, Johnny?
And then you get into that beautiful topic of variations, which is so...
I love a variation.
He's so impatient.
I love the smell of variations in the morning.
And this is where the Domestic Building Act really does its best work. In the old days, a builder would simply tell someone, oh, yeah, sorry, that's been a bit more. I'm sorry, your land's got a bit of an extra fall on it. I'm sorry, that's going to be an extra. Oh, I'm sorry, those bricks weren't available. I got you some really good ones which aren't much more expensive, but that'll be a variation. No, the Domestic Building Act requires a big, sensible notification, approval, pricing, payment in the next progress payment structure that wasn't there in the old days. It's all set out in the Building Act itself. It starts with sometimes the variation is requested by the owner, like Hugh's windows. Hugh wouldn't know a window if he fell out of one, but nevertheless, he may well decide he wants a double done. And he would normally say to the builder, I think I want these windows, not those windows that are currently in the drawings and specifications. The builder will go, oh, gee, well, look, I'm sure we can get it for you for less than $8 million. It'll give you a price for that variation. The good news, it's an easy variation. You get a price and you do or don't have to do it.
Good. Choices.
Other variations are less charming. Sometimes things go wrong. In the old days, under building contracts, like commercial contracts, they'd have a big argument about things to do with foundations, latent conditions.
Hang on. Latent conditions? Slow down again. What's that?
Latent conditions is a claim to do with sometimes when the builder comes onto the site and starts building, the ground conditions are worse than they thought they would be. It's either too soft and muddy, or
isn't it their job to know what the ground's going to be?
Yeah, to an extent that's true. The contract will always be that a builder is meant to inspect the site and know about the conditions and take that risk. But that risk is always except for things that are beyond that which would normally be reasonably anticipated.
So if they start digging and they discover a nuclear missile silo.
Nuclear missile silos have been, submarines. People do have claims for latent conditions when things are wildly different. Of course they do. And of course they should. But under the Victorian legislation, since about 1990, there's a special section on foundations, and builders have to arrange a foundation inspection, investigation, reporting, and that becomes part of the contract documentation. So as a matter of fact, that in itself has been a good way to try to avoid the historic ground conditions types of claims. But there's other types of claims. And, for example, the big one used to be the site's got a bit more slope on it. People would agree a price, $700,000 for a house, and then the builder would say, I'm sorry, the slope's more than usual. And people say, what do you mean more than usual? I didn't know there was a usual. As a matter of fact, before the contract is executed, there's usually a discussion about what the variations will be that a sensible builder has properly investigated and should know before they start work.
Well, you would have thought things like slope they should know, because as soon as they're on it, they can see it.
And yet we have the claims.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, though, in Victoria in 2024, that's not usually a claim because, in fact, people know. And, in fact, they bother to go to. And, in fact, the legislation has made it very difficult for a builder to have an unpleasant surprise variation, a variation for work that has just emerged that hadn't been anticipated at the time of the execution, which is historically a big problem.
All right. So if one of these big problems just happens to emerge, what should our homeowner be doing?
The Act sets out the process carefully. The builder, if the builder wants to do a variation, is to give a quote to the owner and get written approval. The owner, if the owner wants a variation, will get a quote from the builder, and it's not a variation unless and until they give approval. In certain circumstances, very limited circumstances, the builder can go to the building surveyor and say, this work has occurred because of this. This is not something that could have been anticipated in the contract and priced. And in certain very limited circumstances, the building surveyor will give the order, give the direction. But the real point you need to know is the process, because it's set out in plain English in the Act, and variations do happen on all construction projects, not just house building, but they're always unpleasant, and especially with house contracts where, in fact, most of the money will usually be coming from a bank. It's always a drama to get a progress claim, which
How do they work out
variations.
the cost for these variations?
The cost of the whole project is usually agreed at the time when they're signing the contract, and then broken down across the stages. For example, it'll usually be so many percent for base stage, so many percent for frame stage, so many percent for lock-up, fixing, 100% at completion. But the variations, because they're coming from time to time, which no one had anticipated, you go through the process under the Act, and then once they've got approval, and then once they have been performed, they're added to the next progress claim. Now, that's difficult on a normal commercial project, but again, on a home building project, that means that the owner not only is going to have to explain to the bank why they need to advance more or get the money themselves, they also need to anticipate when that might come and get sign-offs from the bank before they get variations, for example, to use windows. Unless they're going to pay for those windows themselves.
Or they're worth it.
Yeah, not likely. But unless they're going to pay for it themselves, they need to make sure that when the time comes, when it's included in the right progress claim, the bank's ready for that. We are serious about getting your home building contract checked. It's a mistake that is made regularly. The TV screens are full of sad stories about people sadly talking about their dream home while sitting outside a half-built house. Every one of those things is avoidable, and 99% of the time, if it happens, there's remedies with insurance.
Am I right in thinking that about the only time these contracts usually even get looked at, let alone checked, is after the thing's done, when all the tears are falling from your face?
Normally I'd say sadly he's right, but here I'm saying tragically he's right. It's a life-moving thing to be in your first home contract and get halfway through and then something goes wildly wrong. It's shattering. You haven't got the house. You're not likely to have it in for any long period, and worse, you're worried, terrified about money. It's easily avoidable. Every person who's going to sign a house contract, whether it's a first house contract for you and the family, or it's your seventh house contract, then it's something you're familiar with every time. In Victoria, all the contracts themselves are standard forms usually. They're either a HIA contract or a master builder's contract, but they still need to be checked, and the details need to be checked, and the insurance, we're begging you, needs to be checked that it's in place. When Porter Davis went broke just recently, it was horrifying that we found out later that a dramatically large percentage of the contracts that they had executed, contrary to the Act, the insurance hadn't been put in place, probably because they were having they're on the process to becoming insolvent. And we're simply saying every one of those things is checkable and critical, and usually will save the day when things go wrong. The real thrust of the podcast.
So if you're listening to this podcast and you got this far, but you listen to this podcast and you are considering building your first home or building a home and you got a contract, what should they do?
Get somebody to check the contract who knows what the hell they're looking at.
I beg you, if you're about to do a home contract, just find our website, mcmullenconstructionlaw.com, and you'll be right. We'll give you the letter you can take to your bank. We'll make sure you know. But what you won't be is one of the disaster stories that I do guarantee.
Fantastic. Great. All right.
Can Coco come back up now?
Yes.
I think can we go? Coco says she wants to do the podcast, but
Plenty
can we
of-
please be downstairs?
Plenty of people want us to go.
A lot of people want to.